In this video, I discuss natural wine. So what the heck is natural wine anyway? It's a very ambiguous term, and it's always difficult to determine what exactly someone means when they use the term natural wine. However, it typically refers to a wine where the winemaker uses the approach nothing added, nothing removed. This applies both to the practices in the vineyard as well as in the winery. With respect to the vineyard practices, this oftentimes means that at a minimum, the grapes will be from fruit that is either organic or biodynamic or perhaps both. They're not necessarily certified, but at a minimum you would typically expect to have organic fruit used for natural wine. This means that there won't be pesticides or chemicals used in the vineyard. Another thing you'll oftentimes find with natural winemakers is that they don't use irrigation. In other words, they will dry farm their vineyards. Oftentimes they will typically use indigenous grape varietals as well. Indigenous grape varietals are those that are native to a particular area and will oftentimes do well without additional irrigation, just relying on the natural climate. The third thing that you'll oftentimes find in the vineyard when you're making a natural wine is that grapes are hand harvested. And so they don't use machines to harvest the grapes, rather they'll have hand harvesting. This is important because oftentimes it will be necessary to make multiple passes through the vineyard. It's really important to pick the grapes when they're perfectly ripe when you're making a natural wine. And this is because you're unable to make adjustments through chemical additives during the winemaking process when you're producing a natural wine. So for that reason, you need perfectly ripe fruit. Shifting gears a little bit into the winemaking techniques used to produce a natural wine, once again, the goal is to not use additives and not to use technology to manipulate the wines. And so typically the grapes will be hand sorted once they arrive at the winery. They will then be crushed either by foot, and yes, some people still use their feet to crush the grapes, or more commonly by a basket press. Following the crushing, they also use wild yeast rather than commercial yeast that's purchased. As mentioned earlier, they will not use any additives either to make chemical adjustments to the wine. And so they won't add any acids or coloring agents or sugar or things of that nature. As many as 70 different adjustments or additives that can be made to wines. And so at the most, typically with natural wine, they'll use a little bit of sulfur prior to bottling. But other than that, they won't be using any additives generally to make natural wines. In addition, winemakers who make natural wine typically do not either fine or filter their wines. While this can definitely improve the wines, it definitely also strips them of some flavor. And so the goal of the natural winemaker is to faithfully express the terroir. They're not necessarily trying to make a perfect wine or wine that will appeal to the largest number of consumers. Lastly, natural winemakers tend not to use new oak because that would again transform the taste of the wine. Instead, they would use neutral oak or stainless steel, concrete, or perhaps amphora to age their wines. There are many pros and cons to natural winemaking. Certainly, it's considered to be a good thing that they don't use a lot of chemicals, either in the vineyard or in the wine. Another positive is that oftentimes the wines are lower in alcohol, which oftentimes has some health benefits for the consumer. There are some challenges, however. For example, due to the use of wild yeasts, it's oftentimes very difficult to make a consistent wine from year to year, and you could experience lots of vintage variation making natural wine. This is because the wild yeasts are less predictable than commercial yeasts. This can be challenging for consumers because they may like one particular vintage from a producer, but not the next, or vice versa. For me, personally, I've also experienced mouseflaw with natural wines. This is a smell that's experienced as a taste. And so you're not able to detect it just by smelling the wine, but when you taste it, you can definitely experience it. I've heard it described either as a taste that's like puppy breath or a kombucha experiment gone wrong, and definitely as mouse as well. And by mouse, they typically refer to what you would expect if you were tasting a dirty mouse cage or a rat's nest, something of that nature. So certainly something very, very horribly unpleasant and that you don't want to experience in your wine. Interestingly though, some winemakers have had good success preventing mouse by adding a small amount of sulfur prior to fermentation. The problem with this, however, is that most natural winemakers believe that you're only supposed to add sulfur prior to bottling if you add it at all. So there's a little bit of tension there between a way to prevent mouse and following the strict or most desirable methods for producing a natural wine. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next one. I'll be coming out with videos like this at least once a week. Until then, drink well.